All right, let me ask you something. Have you ever loved a game, or anything really, so much that you actually wished it would just fail? I know, it sounds crazy, right? But back in 2013, that's exactly what happened in the community of this totally unique online game. The players got so fed up with the developer, they started this, serious debate about whether the best thing that could happen was for the company to go bankrupt. So, yeah, we're going to unpack this incredible story. It's a community right on the edge, and the debate they had, it's maybe more relevant now than it ever was.
And it all started with this one sentence, right there on a fan forum. A player, someone who'd been in the game for 7 years, posts this absolute bombshell. And just like that, it kicks off this massive debate about the future of their digital world, and more importantly, their real-world money. It's a wild statement to make for sure, but trust me, the reasons why he said it are even crazier.
Okay, so to really get why this was a big deal, you gotta understand the game itself. See, Entropia Universe, it's not like World of Warcraft or your typical online game. It runs on what's called a real cash economy. The in-game currency, called a PED, has a fixed exchange rate to the US dollar. That means you can deposit real money to get PED, and you can withdraw your PED back into real dollars. So people have actual financial stakes in this thing. We're talking thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, all tied up in their virtual gear and currency. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the core dilemma of this real money game. Then we'll get into the actual case for letting it all collapse. After that, we'll explore the huge risks involved in that gamble. And the big one, what happens to all that player money? And finally, we'll see if they figured out another way to solve things. All right, so first up, a real money game's dilemma. This wasn't your standard player complaint situation. No, this was a completely unique crisis of faith, and it was all because of how the game itself was built. And here's the most important thing you have to understand. This was never about players hating the game. It was the exact opposite. They loved this unique concept. They'd poured years of their lives and tons of real money into it. All their frustration was pointed at one target, the developer, Mindark. They felt like the company was taking this brilliant idea and just completely squandering its potential, running it right into the ground. So that deep, deep frustration is what brings us to the most, let's call it radical part of this whole debate, the actual case for a collapse. It sounds completely insane, right? So why on earth did some of these players think that the company going bankrupt was the only way forward? Well, the player who started the whole thread, he laid out a whole list of grievances. First, there was basically zero communication from the company. Then there was what he called a history of lies, lies, and more lies about features they promised but never delivered. And on top of that, there were just these bizarre business decisions. Like, why would a Swedish game developer buy a castle in Germany? It just didn't make sense. And to these players, it all just screamed incompetence. But the financial argument was maybe the most powerful one. The original poster, who was a business owner himself, pointed out this huge red flag. He said, look, healthy businesses borrow money at low interest rates, like under 3%. But Mindark, they were raising cash by selling virtual land deeds to the players, promising a return on investment of around 25%. And his point was no stable company on earth would pay that kind of rate for money. It was a sign of pure, absolute desperation. So what was the optimistic endgame here? Well, the hope, the belief, was that the game's core concept was just too strong, too valuable to let die. The thinking was, if Mindark goes under, the game's decade-long history and its unique real cash economy would be an immediate magnet for new, better investors, people who would actually know how to run the business. It was this crazy idea of finding salvation through total destruction. Okay, but as you can imagine, a lot of people saw this burn-it-all-down plan as a seriously risky gamble. And the rest of the community, well, they started to push back pretty hard, warning everyone that the reality of a collapse would be way, way more complicated and dangerous than they were imagining. Yeah, other players jumped in and started painting a much grimmer picture. They were like, okay, you're hoping for this perfect, professional new owner to swoop in. But what's the reality? What if no investors are interested? Or what if the only people who show up are, as one user put it, next island type investors? Which, for context, was a jab at a previous partner that really didn't have a great reputation. People were pointing to real-world examples, like the super messy bankruptcy of Saab, the car company, just to show that these kinds of takeovers are almost never clean and simple. And this is where a really brilliant counter-argument popped up. See, one of the biggest complaints was Mindark's secrecy, right? Their lack of communication. But one user flipped that completely on its head. They said, what if that secrecy isn't a flaw?
What if it's actually an essential feature to protect the game's entire economy?
So here's how that works. Imagine Mindark announces, "Hey everyone, a big new update is coming next month." Well, any players with that inside knowledge could immediately go and buy up all the in-game items related to that update. Then, when the update drops, the value of those items skyrockets. You've basically just created an unfair market that works exactly like real-world insider trading. So the argument was, by keeping everything a secret, Mindark was actually preventing this from happening and keeping the economy from getting totally destabilized.
And that was the core of the defense, really. People argued that running a real cash economy game like this is like sailing in totally uncharted water. There's no rule book, no guide to follow. And yeah, Mindark made a lot of mistakes, but they also had more experience doing this one specific weird thing than any other company on the planet. A new owner might come in, not get any of these little details, and just make everything 1,000 times worse. So all these arguments, for and against the collapse, it all came down to the single most important multi-million-dollar question, the one that every single player with money in the game was thinking: if Mindark actually goes bankrupt, what happens to our stuff?
And here's the cold, hard, sobering reality of it. In a bankruptcy, by definition, the company's out of money. There's nothing left to pay its debts. And here's the kicker. Your in-game items, your virtual currency, none of that is considered a legally recognized debt. In the eyes of the law, the players would be at the absolute bottom of the list to get paid, which means they had basically zero chance of getting a single penny back. One user in the thread put it perfectly, and it's pretty chillin'. He said that if MA went bankrupt, quote, all the players' holdings would go puff. Just gone.
I mean, just look at this breakdown. Those big player-owned estates, some of them worth thousands of real-world dollars, after bankruptcy, they're worth zero. That super rare item you have with a high market value on the player market, zero. Even the in-game currency, the PED that's supposed to be fixed to the US dollar, that's worth zero too. The risk wasn't just losing some money, it was a total catastrophic financial wipeout for every single player. So once people were faced with that terrifying reality, the idea of everything just vanishing, the whole tone of the conversation started to shift. People realized, okay, maybe the nuclear option is a little too risky. They started brainstorming for another way forward, looking for alternatives to just letting the whole thing burn. So instead of just wishing for bankruptcy, users started pitching actual solutions. Things like, hey, what if we got a group of investors together and made a direct offer to buy the company? Or what if Mindark sold shares directly to the players, so we'd all have a real stake in its future? And of course, some people argued for the simplest path, just demanding better communication and better management. And you know, some folks even came to Mindark's defense. They pointed out that for all its problems, the company had somehow kept this incredibly complex game running for 10 years. They started listing off all the player-requested features that Mindark did eventually implement over the years, arguing that, you know, maybe they were listening, just really, really slowly. But there was one key challenge that nobody could really get around, even with the buyout idea. One user pointed out that the reason nobody else had ever really tried to compete with Entropia Universe is because it's a super niche, incredibly complex, and honestly a pretty controversial business model. The very thing that made the game so special was also the thing that would probably scare off all those serious professional investors everyone was dreaming about. And that line of thinking led to what might be the most compelling idea to come out of this whole massive debate. It's summed up perfectly by this one user who said, Mon doesn't need to go bankrupt. Mon needs a less greedy competitor that will keep them on their toes. The real answer wasn't destruction. It was competition. A rival game could be the one thing that would actually force Mindark to get better, or risk losing everything. So this whole story from 2013 leaves us with a question that's more relevant today than ever before. When we invest our time and our real money into these virtual worlds, what do we actually own? And what happens when the digital landlord we all depend on starts to fail? It's a question that in our increasingly digital lives, we're all going to have to figure out.